The day Adrian Sterling secured the majority shares of the Sterling Group, he ended our 3-year relationship. Not quietly, not peacefully. He appeared before the media with his new lover and announced to the world that I was dead. 3 months later, we met again, at an investment bidding conference. This time, I wasn't standing behind him. I was sitting at the front of the room. As Isabella Hawthorne, the eldest daughter of the powerful Hawthorne family, when the final bid opened, I calmly raised my paddle. 50 million. The room fell silent. With a single move, I took the project Adrian had spent months securing, the one he believed was already his. The conference ended in stunned whispers, but Adrian didn't leave. Instead, he cornered me in a hallway, his eyes red, his voice rough with emotion. "Bella, I regret it." Before he could touch me, my bodyguards forced him back against the wall. I looked down at him coldly. "Watch your place, Mr. Sterling." My voice was calm, detached. "The Sterling Group is not enough to act arrogant in front of a Hawthorne, is it?" "Break up." The message Adrian sent me contained only 2 words. I was standing in a crowded market buying groceries for dinner. Just a minute earlier, I had texted him gently, "I'm cooking your favorite tomato beef stew tonight." Then his message appeared. The tomatoes slipped from my hands and rolled across the pavement. I panicked and ran home without even taking my basket. At the entrance of our old apartment complex, a small truck was parked outside. Workers were carrying boxes downstairs, and Adrian stood at the doorway directing them. "Adrian?" I ran up to him, forcing a smile. "Why are you moving things? Are you going back to your hometown? Why didn't you ask me to come with you?" I grabbed his arm. He shook me off immediately, frowning. "Didn't you see my text?" My chest tightened. "I saw it. But it must be a joke, right?" His voice turned cold. "It's not a joke. We're done, Isabella." The words hit me like ice water. "Why?" I couldn't understand. 3 years together. 3 years of living in a cramped apartment, eating cheap meals, struggling through every hardship. We had promised each other that when things got better, we would finally live a good life. Adrian looked at me with distant eyes. "Because we're not from the same world." Before I could respond, a sleek black luxury car stopped outside the building. A beautiful woman stepped out. Elegant, expensive. Everything about her screamed wealth. She walked straight to Adrian and slipped her arm around his. "Adrian, are you finished here?" He nodded. Then he looked at me again, calm, detached. "Isabella, let me introduce. This is Clara Whitmore, my fiancée." My mind went blank. "Fiancée?" Clara smiled sweetly, as if greeting an old friend. "Isabella, I've heard about you." Her tone was polite, but her eyes held faint amusement. I suddenly felt ridiculous standing there in my cheap clothes, holding a plastic bag of vegetables. Adrian spoke again, his voice emotionless. "My real identity is the heir of the Sterling Group. I came here 3 years ago because my family wanted me to experience ordinary life. I stayed longer than planned." Every word felt like a knife. "So, our relationship was just a phase," he finished. Clara squeezed his arm possessively. "Adrian has returned to his world now. And you should return to yours." The movers carried out the last box. Everything that belonged to Adrian was gone, just like that. 3 years of memories erased in a single afternoon. I stood frozen. Adrian finally looked at me one last time. "You'll receive compensation." Compensation. As if our relationship were a business transaction. My hands trembled. "I don't want your money." His expression hardened. "Take it. You'll need it more than I do." Then he turned and walked toward the car with Clara, without looking back. The luxury car drove away, leaving me alone in the dusty courtyard. That night, I returned to the empty apartment. Half the furniture was gone. Even the small sofa we bought together had been taken. I sat on the cold floor. For a long time, I didn't move. Finally, my phone rang. It was a number I hadn't seen in years. I answered slowly. A deep voice spoke on the other end. "Miss Hawthorne?" It's time for you to come home. My fingers tightened around the phone. Home. A place I had run away from 3 years ago. The Hawthorne family, one of the wealthiest dynasties in the country. I closed my eyes. Fine, I said quietly. I'm coming back. 3 months later, the investment bidding conference was packed with executives and reporters. When I entered the room, whispers spread instantly. The Hawthorne family's eldest daughter is here. She disappeared for years, didn't she? They say she's finally returning to the business world. I ignored the murmurs and took my seat. Across the room sat Adrian Sterling. He looked even more composed than before. Successful, powerful, the perfect heir of the Sterling Empire. But the moment our eyes met, his expression froze. Because the woman he once abandoned was now sitting among the top investors. The bidding began. Several companies competed fiercely for the project. Adrian's offer quickly became the highest. Everyone assumed the deal was already his, until I raised my paddle. 50 million. Gasps rippled through the hall. The chairman hesitated. Miss Hawthorne, are you certain? I smiled faintly. Very. Adrian stared at me, disbelief flashing across his face. The final hammer fell. The project belonged to the Hawthorne family. After the meeting ended, I walked down a quiet hallway. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my wrist. Adrian, his eyes were red. Isabella, why didn't you tell me? I slowly removed his hand. Tell you what? That you're part of the Hawthorne family. I looked at him calmly. Would it have changed anything? He fell silent. His voice dropped. I made a mistake. I regret it. Before he could step closer, my bodyguards stepped forward and restrained him. I gazed down at him coldly. Mr. Sterling, please remember your position. The Sterling Group is nothing compared to the Hawthorne family. Then I turned and walked away. Without looking back, Adrian stood frozen in the corridor long after Isabella walked away. For the first time in his life, the always composed heir of the Sterling Group felt something dangerously close to panic. He had believed Isabella was ordinary, a girl from a small town, gentle, quiet, dependent on him. But the woman who had just walked past him carried the cold authority of someone born into power, a Hawthorne. The realization struck him like lightning. 3 years. He had spent 3 years with her, and he had never known. Inside the conference room, executives were still discussing the shocking result of the bid. The Hawthorne family suddenly entering this project, that's huge. Sterling Group must be furious. Did you see Mr. Sterling's face just now? The whispers spread like wildfire. Meanwhile, Isabella calmly signed the acquisition documents. Her assistant leaned closer and spoke softly. Miss Hawthorne, the board asked if you'd like to attend tonight's celebration dinner. Isabella closed the folder. No. Her tone was calm but distant. I have other matters to deal with. She stood and walked out. The moment Isabella stepped outside the building, a black Rolls-Royce pulled up beside the curb. Her bodyguard opened the door. Inside sat an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes. Edward Hawthorne, her grandfather, the true head of the Hawthorne Empire. You did well today, he said. Isabella smiled faintly. It was nothing. Edward studied her carefully. Did you see Adrian Sterling? She paused briefly. Yes. And? Isabella looked out the window as the car began moving. Nothing worth mentioning. But deep inside, the old wound still ached faintly. Across the city, inside the towering headquarters of the Sterling Group, tension filled the executive boardroom. Adrian sat at the head of the table. Several senior executives were arguing nervously. That project was practically ours! The Hawthorne family intervening at the last moment. There must be a reason. We need to negotiate with them. Adrian remained silent. His mind replayed Isabella's cold expression. Finally, he spoke. Arrange a meeting. With the Hawthorne family. That evening, Isabella arrived at the Hawthorne estate. The mansion stood on a hill overlooking the city lights. Servants lined the entrance. Welcome home, Miss Hawthorne. It had been 3 years since she last stepped inside this place. 3 years ago, she had left everything behind for Adrian. Now she had returned as someone entirely different. At dinner, Edward suddenly asked, "Do you still have feelings for him?" The question was blunt. Isabella set down her fork slowly. "No." Edward watched her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Good. The Hawthorne family does not chase after men who betray them." Meanwhile, Adrian received a shocking piece of information from his assistant. "Mr. Sterling, there's something you should know." The assistant placed a thick file on the desk. Adrian opened it. Inside were documents detailing the Hawthorne family's corporate empire. Dozens of subsidiaries, global investments, assets that dwarfed even the Sterling Group. At the very top of the family hierarchy stood one name: Isabella Hawthorne, primary heir. Adrian slowly closed the file. His expression darkened. For the first time since their breakup, regret began to settle heavily in his chest. Late that night, Adrian drove alone through the city. Without realizing it, he stopped outside the small apartment building where he and Isabella had once lived. The place looked exactly the same, but she was gone. Back then, she had cooked dinner every night, waited for him, smiled at him as if he were her entire world. Adrian clenched his hands on the steering wheel. He had thought leaving her was easy. Now he realized it wasn't. The next morning, Isabella began officially taking over several Hawthorne business operations. Her assistant reported, "The Sterling Group has requested a formal meeting." Isabella paused. "For what?" "They want to discuss cooperation on the project you acquired yesterday." She smiled faintly. "Interesting." 3 months ago, Adrian had treated her like someone insignificant. Now he wanted cooperation. "Schedule it," she said calmly. "Make them wait." 2 days later, Adrian finally arrived at the Hawthorne headquarters. The towering glass building reflected the morning sunlight. Employees whispered as he entered, "That's Adrian Sterling. Why is he here?" "Something big must be happening." Adrian stepped into the elevator. His expression was calm, but inside, his heart was beating harder than usual. Because on the top floor, Isabella was waiting. The elevator doors opened. Adrian walked into the executive office. Isabella sat behind a wide desk, reviewing documents. When she looked up, her gaze was cool and composed. No warmth, no familiarity, just the distant politeness reserved for business partners. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "what brings you here?" Adrian studied her for several seconds. Then he spoke quietly. "I want to talk about the project." Isabella leaned back slightly. "Of course. But before that," her eyes sharpened, "I think you owe me an explanation." Silence filled the office. Adrian felt an unfamiliar tension. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals before without hesitation. Yet standing in front of Isabella now felt far more difficult. Finally, he said, "I didn't know who you really were." Isabella let out a small laugh. "Is that your excuse?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "If I had known—" She cut him off immediately. "You would have treated me differently?" Her voice was calm, but the words carried unmistakable sharpness. Adrian didn't answer. Isabella stood slowly and walked toward the window overlooking the city. Without turning around, she said, "Mr. Sterling, business is business. Our past—" She paused briefly. "Is already over." The sentence echoed in Adrian's mind like a door slamming shut. Yet the woman standing by the window looked painfully familiar. The same graceful silhouette, the same quiet composure. Except now, she belonged to a world far above his reach. Adrian finally spoke. "We still need to discuss the project." Isabella turned slowly. Her expression had returned to its usual calm professionalism. "Go ahead." The meeting lasted nearly an hour. Throughout the discussion, Isabella remained perfectly composed. Sharp, precise. Every negotiation point she raised was calculated. Adrian realized something unsettling. She had changed. The girl who once relied on him had become a formidable businesswoman. At the end of the meeting, Adrian asked quietly, Are you really planning to cooperate with the Sterling Group? Isabella closed her folder. That depends on your sincerity. Adrian met her gaze. You'll have it. News of the meeting spread quickly across the business world. Headlines appeared that afternoon. Sterling Group seeks cooperation with Hawthorne Empire. Speculation exploded. Inside the Sterling headquarters, several executives were uneasy. Mr. Sterling, the Hawthorne family is far more powerful than us. Partnering with them might place us in a weak position. Adrian remained calm. Then we'll simply become stronger. But privately, he knew the truth. His real reason had nothing to do with business. It had everything to do with Isabella. Meanwhile, Isabella attended a charity gala that evening. The grand ballroom glittered with crystal lights and elegant guests. When she entered, conversations immediately shifted. Is that Isabella Hawthorne? She's stunning. I heard she returned to take over the Hawthorne Empire. Isabella ignored the whispers, but another figure in the room was watching her closely. A tall man leaning against the bar. Dark hair, sharp eyes. Alexander Knight, one of the most powerful investors in the country, and a longtime ally of the Hawthorne family. Alexander approached her with a relaxed smile. Bella. Only a few people were allowed to call her that. Isabella's expression softened slightly. Alexander. He studied her thoughtfully. You're finally back in the game. I never left, she replied lightly. Alexander chuckled. I also heard Adrian Sterling has been meeting with you. Her gaze cooled. Business only. Alexander raised an eyebrow. I hope so. Across the ballroom, Adrian had just arrived. The moment he stepped inside, he saw her. Isabella stood beneath the chandelier, radiant in a deep red evening gown, more beautiful than he remembered, and standing beside her, another man. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. He recognized him immediately. Alexander Knight, a dangerous rival in both business and influence. Adrian walked toward them. When he stopped beside Isabella, Alexander gave him a faintly amused glance. Well, if it isn't Mr. Sterling. Adrian's voice was calm. Mr. Knight. The air between the two men felt instantly tense. Isabella noticed the silent confrontation and sighed internally. She turned to Adrian. Is there something you need? Adrian hesitated briefly. I wanted to speak with you. Alexander smirked. About business? Adrian answered evenly. Yes. But everyone present knew the truth was more complicated. Later that evening, Isabella stepped out onto the balcony for fresh air. City lights stretched endlessly below. Moments later, footsteps sounded behind her. Adrian. You've been avoiding me, he said quietly. She didn't turn. I've been busy. With Alexander Knight? Isabella finally glanced over her shoulder. Is that any of your concern? Adrian's expression darkened. I just want to know where I stand. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Isabella said calmly, Mr. Sterling, I think you're misunderstanding something. She faced him fully now. Our relationship ended 3 months ago. Whatever I do now has nothing to do with you now. The words were sharp but honest. Adrian felt them hit harder than he expected. Still, he asked quietly, Is there really no chance for us? Isabella looked at him for several seconds. Memories flickered briefly in her mind. 3 years of love. 3 years of believing he was her future. But those days were gone. She finally spoke. Adrian. It was the first time she had called him by his name since they reunited, but the softness lasted only a moment. I don't walk backward. Then she turned and walked back into the ballroom, leaving Adrian alone beneath the night sky.